This past year, I set myself a simple goal: upload one video per week. And I can honestly say that as far as YouTube is concerned, this past year has been my best year ever, comfortably. Obviously, my audience has got bigger and I've got way more views. Of my 10 most popular videos, 7 of them have been from this past year. But overall, I've just enjoyed making these videos a lot more. I've tried to start being a bit more creative with my production, and I've found it more artistically fulfilling. But the main big thing is that every single video that I've made this past year has been worthwhile, it's had a point, and that point has, I believe, been well communicated. And I would genuinely say, if you are subscribed to my channel, then it's worth watching every single one of my videos from this past year at least once. And with that said, I thought for the new year, I would give all 52 of my videos from 2024 a rewatch, and now I can summarize all of them as a little recap. I will also link below a playlist of all of these videos so you can work through them yourself as you're doing some washing up, going to the gym, playing a video game, basically something where you can just listen to something casually and you can work your way through the playlist at your leisure. In the meantime though, as a primer, I will jump into summarizing these videos. Oh, and at the end I'll include an extensive summary of how this year has been for me more generally, but since this is a bit of a TLDW style video, I didn't think it would be good to include a ramble at the beginning. So let's jump in with the very first video of last year. This video recounts a series of Twitter exchanges with Katie Montgomery, who mocked gender criticals, saying that women are not a subset of females because there is a strict mathematical definition which says that something is a subset of that which it is identical to. I pointed out that there is a colloquial definition of subset where something must be smaller than that which it is a subset of, and Katie completely fell apart trying to debunk this, claiming that anything other than the strict mathematical definition is automatically wrong and you're stupid if you use it. And the icing on the cake here is that many of the TRAs in response to Katie's original tweet weren't aware of the mathematical definition, so if Katie's saying that makes you stupid, it would make all the TRAs stupid as well. Next video tackles a simple claim from PhilosophyTube that sex and gender are spectra which, when graphed against each other on a chart, will produce an overlapping bell curve, and the same for height and sex. 3 big issues here are, firstly, what conceptually does this even mean? If you take these 3 very different concepts and graph them against each other, what is the x-axis such that they can be placed along the same continuum? Secondly, even if you did that, you wouldn't get 2 overlapping bell curves, you'd get 2 bimodal distributions, not bell curves. And thirdly, the real issue here is if you wanted to represent height as it relates to sex on a chart, you would get 2 overlapping bell curves, but that's precisely because sex isn't a spectrum. You would get 1 bell curve for male height and another bell curve for female height, 2 bell curves for the 2 sexes. So no, sex isn't a spectrum, and that's literally what's being shown by the charts that PhilosophyTube uses in the video. Next, I doubled up responding to PhilosophyTube with this video where PhilosophyTube tries to argue that the NHS is institutionally transphobic because they aren't doing enough for trans people. The big issue is that the NHS is chronically underfunded anyway, and PhilosophyTube doesn't provide any argument for transphobia being the issue instead of that underfunding. Except for in arguing that if we got rid of all safeguards then that would be cheaper, but yeah, obviously, but safeguards are there for a reason. Also, there's a moment where PhilosophyTube implies you can only escape gendered expectations by transitioning, and then ends the video by trying to lure people into becoming trans. Obviously, an incredibly manipulative and harmful message to present to gender non-conforming kids there. Next is the first video that's topical rather than a response regarding mental health. Basically, I argue there are 3 tiers by which we can deal with mental health issues: personal lifestyle changes, broad societal changes, and then direct medicalization. And my argument is that we should progress sequentially through these in order to avoid medicalization where possible. And of course, I strongly suspect that affirming trans identity is not the best solution to gender dysphoria, but even if we were to consider it, it would only make sense after we've absolutely proven that the first 2 potential solutions that don't involve unnecessary medicalization definitely wouldn't work. I also spend a lot of the video relating this to my own mental health issues just to show that I do take mental health very seriously because I have personal experience with it. And on that note, I will say that my mental health has only been getting better and better since this video. Next is this video on Charlie is so cool like becoming trans. My main point here is that Charlie tries to present this as not your typical coming out story for a trans person, but it's literally about watching anime and wearing a pink dress in a video game. And also Charlie communicates a great deal of discomfort with the idea of being considered feminine as a man, and that seems to me just as good as admitting that the standard criticism of trans identity is true, that it's mostly born out of a discomfort that a lot of trans identifying males have with the idea that it is okay for a male to just be feminine and still be a man. Moving on to February, this video argues that people who only focus on poking holes in other theories tend to not be that interested in understanding the world. If you do care about understanding the world, then you'll actually come up with your own holistic, intricate theory to explain things. Sex as a binary actually does involve looking at human biology holistically and trying to understand it, whereas sex as a spectrum is largely just about trying to poke holes in the binary model. And they themselves overwhelmingly don't have any interest in actually engaging with understanding biological sex as a spectrum, because deep down, they don't actually believe that. They just don't care because they're not really interested in understanding it. Next, we have this video where I basically just point out that trans activists tend to use a lot of flowery language without actually saying anything. But my big argument is that they intentionally use poetic and pseudo-spiritual language because that has the effect of being evocative of something deep and meaningful. In other words, they're often substituting actually saying something for just sounding like they're saying something. My response to Lily Alexandria on What is a Woman was pretty long, but here are two big issues I had. One, Lily tended to express any disagreement over the definition of a word as a legitimate difference of opinion in that definition. For example, Lily says that the adult human female definition for woman doesn't work because various ethnic groups in history have not been considered human at various points, implying, therefore, that that is actually an ambiguity in the term human, rather than the people who thought that were just wrong in saying certain ethnic groups aren't humans. Lily also presents nonsense claims like that lesbians aren't women, or that literally every single human being is a female, again, just as examples of interesting disagreement and diversity of thought. And that's the big issue of Lily's whole video. Ideas are presented, but they're not evaluated at all, such that Lily ends up implicitly just legitimizing loads of nonsense and immoral ideas. And you won't be surprised to hear that Lily never actually provides a definition of woman, so the video fails even on its titular point. Next, we have my breakdown of this debate between Colin Wright and Stephen Woodford. The big issue here is that the moderator starts off with people wanting to agree on certain definitions as part of the preliminary stage for the debate. But early on, he tries to get them to agree on the definition of the word woman, even though that's literally the whole point of the debate. So he accidentally kickstarts the debate before he's established many other important terms he should have defined first. So the debate based on that is kind of DOA, and just for the record, Woodford's definition for woman is absolutely terrible because it fails even to distinguish a woman from a man. Also, literally, his entire definition is qualified with the word typically, so it's not even a reliable definition anyway. After this, we had a rather more serious exploration of anti-trans violence. It started with me going through a recent example of a trans-identified person being attacked in the UK and showing that there was in fact very little evidence this was based on transphobia. I then elaborated on how the real issue is an increase in violence amongst young people in general in the UK, and even said with that in mind, it might make sense to understand this attack sociologically as part of a wider phenomenon of violence amongst teenage girls in keeping with the trans identity of the victim. And as such, those who claim that we can only understand trans victims of violence as victims of transphobia are actually being less trans-affirming than me. Trans teenagers are young people who are experiencing violence the same way many young people are in the UK right now, and to claim we can't understand the trans experience as similar to those of other young people is basically saying we can't understand trans people as people just like everyone else. This video, inspired by Essence of Thought bullying a female YouTuber, has one really simple point. Bullies tend to dislike the idea of objective truth, because you can't bully objective truth. Objective truth doesn't care what you think. As such, where possible, we should hold to the belief that claims are objective rather than subjective if we have a good reason to do so, in the interest of countering bullies. The next video is similarly concise on the slippery slope. Essentially, my point is that we shouldn't dismiss the idea that some movements might go too far as just the slippery slope fallacy, because some movements might actually go too far. However, it's also true that no movement is guaranteed to go too far, and however far a movement has gone, you can always just stop and say, no, this is it. This is where we stop. And as such, the basic conclusion is this: for whatever you believe, it's always legitimate to say, well, I want to go as far as we need to go to get to what's right, and then we have to stop and make sure we go no further. Next is this video where I broadly address why are some gender criticals more conservative in their views. I point out that most GCs do start off as progressive, but once they realize trans identity is wrong, they're likely to start thinking, where else might the progressive left be wrong? I also address the whole guilt by association thing, and point out that if you are a free thinker who doesn't let yourself be constrained by tribalism, you're probably going to find yourself having all sorts of agreements and alliances with people, even groups that you might otherwise massively disagree with on other areas. I especially point out how weird it is that progressives are still doing this guilt by association thing, even with what's happening in Gaza, where many progressives are opposing Israel, even though in opposing Israel, you're likely to find yourself forming alliances with some pretty unsavory characters. The big question I end on, and a question that I really do find very interesting, is can any TRA actually present an argument that takes the form, Nazis agree with you, therefore you're wrong? Because I've never actually seen anybody present that as an argument and make it make sense. Next, for Easter, I uploaded a video about religion. This video is a bit all over the place because I had to lay a huge foundation for this one fundamental claim. Basically, I argue that people who say all religions are pretty much the same and there's no real epistemology for religion remind me of those who say that there's no real definition for woman and no epistemology for language. But honestly, of all my videos, this is probably the hardest to summarize because the video itself is pretty much a summary on my entire attitude towards religion as it relates to trans identity. The next video is much easier to summarize. Trans activists like to gatekeep who can talk about the trans experience based on whether or not you're trans, but they simultaneously believe that anyone can be trans if they just say so. And more broadly, progressives love to talk about privilege and systemic oppression where it's clear that who you are matters, the demographics to which you belong matter, but they simultaneously think that you can just claim to be anything you want, and just claiming that can actually change which demographics you belong to on a whim. Response videos are often harder to summarize if the person I'm responding to wasn't making one singular point, so in the case of John Oliver, I'm going to have to breeze through 3 points. Regarding trans sports, he says trans-identified females on testosterone would have to play against other females if you do it by sex, and that wouldn't be fair, therefore they should play against men. To this, I'd respond by saying that banning people for playing sports after they've taken performance-enhancing substances isn't unfair at all. That's quite an obvious way that you make sure sports is fair. He says that the increase in trans identity is similar to the increase in left-handedness, but left-handedness increased by much less over a much longer period of time, and that's pretty significant as a difference when the rate of increase is the main thing we're concerned with. And he says that puberty blockers aren't a big issue because their main side effect is affecting fertility. But I'd say that children who are way too young to really meaningfully consider whether they'll want kids shouldn't be allowed to mess around with their fertility. Next is a response that actually is easy to summarize. Katie Montgomery argues that post-op trans people have changed the physical signifiers of their sex, and therefore gender-critical people, in focusing on the sex they were born with, are ignoring the current condition of their body and as such are anti-materialist and believe in magical sex souls. Now there are a lot of issues here, but the biggest one is that recognizing the past material conditions of something is still materialism. Just because I change some aspect of my body doesn't mean what was previously true about my body is automatically rendered irrelevant. The next video was responding to Katie's friends and regarded the transracial analogy. I've said before that I think the transracial analogy is easily the strongest case against trans ideology, so unsurprisingly these people weren't able to make a case against it. Instead, they basically just avoided answering the question, and even their own audience called them out for this. Their only argument was that race is inherited while biological sex isn't, which, okay, but that's only true because sex is a binary system. Because you can only have one sex, you can't inherit your sex from your parents because they necessarily were two different sexes. But either way, they never even elaborate on why heritability is relevant here in the first place. My argument that trans activism is not a civil rights movement is based on the provable fact, even admitted by many prominent trans rights activists, that they have largely achieved their goals through behind-the-scenes lobbying rather than democratic grassroots campaigning. campaigning. And this is further substantiated by the fact that the gay marriage movement, for example, only achieved their goal through winning hearts and minds long before they ever achieved any legislative success. By contrast, the Gender Recognition Act was passed without any real popular support or even much knowledge of the goals of trans ideology. This places trans activism in direct contrast to many actual civil rights movements. Next video is even more simple. Trans activists love to talk about how there are third gender categories, and many support the use of neo-pronouns. And this makes their insistence that gender non-conforming males be allowed to call themselves women and claim she/her pronouns make even less sense. Within trans logic, we already have a way of acknowledging these variant gender categorizations, and they're not happy with that because they're still trying to take away the meaning of the word woman, because that's their ultimate goal. Then there's this video about the government banning teaching about trans identity in schools because it's a contested subject. This isn't like Section 28, which is a piece of legislation from the 80s that prohibited schools from teaching about gay relationships. There are many differences, but the biggest one is that this legislation is actually progressive in that its main concern is that children shouldn't learn to define themselves as boys and girls according to sexist stereotypes. So is opposing sexist stereotypes regressive now? Next is a long response to Philosophy Tube, so rather than summarising it, I'm just going to focus on three big issues. Firstly, Philosophy Tube claims that the laws of the UK determine who is a woman, which is the most authoritarian attitude you can have, that government mandate determines truth. Secondly, Philosophy Tube argues that if you're gender critical, you should also critique biological sex, because biological sex is part of gender. But the only way this argument is made is by attaching a whole load of gendered stuff to biological sex, which doesn't need to be there. And then finally, Philosophy Tube argues that because human beings are all quite genetically related to each other relative to the entire animal kingdom, we're not actually that different, so there's no point distinguishing between any of us at all. Obviously, all of these arguments are incredibly stupid, and I assure you there were many more I had to sift through in this response. This video on grammatical gender as applied to inanimate objects is really simple. Some people argue that there is an inconsistency in claiming that third-person pronouns should be applied to human beings based on biological sex, when in many languages there is a feature called grammatical gender, where third-person pronouns are applied to inanimate objects that obviously don't have a sex. However, grammatical gender is best understood as a peculiar quirk of certain languages, and not as a good litmus test for how it makes sense to apply these terms to actual human beings. The aesthetic by ContraPoints is very much devoid of any real points, so much so I'm almost inclined to limit this entirely to making fun of when Contra copes about losing a debate by claiming it was only because the other person was prettier. But just to take one substantial point, Contra likens being a woman to a role you perform like being a doctor. This is obviously just unabashed sexism. Women don't have a certain job that they're supposed to perform in order to be women. They're women because of their biological sex. Next video is another simple one. Sometimes even critics of trans ideology will accidentally affirm trans identity because a reductive view of masculinity and femininity is very pervasive in our culture. Sometimes I might see a so-called trans woman presenting in a feminine way and automatically think to myself, oh, that's a woman. But that's because that association between femininity and being a woman is ingrained in my mind from having been raised in this society. That doesn't mean that's automatically a correct thought for me to have. After this, there's another response video involving the media and transphobia. Again, I'm going to have to limit my summary to just a few aspects of the response. Firstly, Nicholas argues that a documentary interviewing gender-critical people and trans ideologues makes it less even-handed, even though the whole point of even-handed is that you hear both sides. He also tries to argue that gender-critical feminists must all agree with Walsh and have no problem with his sexism and anti-feminism, even though every single gender-critical feminist who spoke about Walsh's documentary, including all of the ones who are given specific focus in Tom's video, all called out Walsh explicitly for his sexism and anti-feminism. Next, we had this video in anticipation of the UK general election. Here, I had only one big point. Voting for Labour to punish the Conservatives makes no sense because they both serve the same corporate establishment, so all you're doing in voting for one to punish the other is giving credibility to the mass delusion that we actually have any sort of choice. Of course, this is an opportunity to reflect on the fact that now Labour have been in charge for 6 months, and Goodness me, it was so much worse than I possibly could have predicted. I mean, right out of the gate, Starmer only got 33.7% of the vote, which is way less than I thought he was going to get. And yeah, despite only getting 33.7% of the vote, meaning 66.3% of people would have preferred someone else, he still won a massive majority because the UK electoral system is complete crap. Speaking of undemocratic, recently Labour have been putting loads of people who lost their local elections into the House of Lords and various other unelected positions. So even though they were specifically rejected by democratic mandate, Labour's now like, well, in that case, we'll just put them into loads of positions that aren't elected. And now Labour are absolutely tanking in the polls, even more than they already were, and I'm just thinking, well, what were you expecting, idiots? You voted for a party that you knew you wouldn't like, and now we've got to deal with that party for another 4.5 years. Thanks a bunch. Next we have a clip show, which I'm going to skip over. If you haven't seen it, I don't mean like clips from previous videos on the channel. I mean shorter videos from a different channel that I started when I was experimenting with doing shorter content, which I've now repurposed for my longer form content that I do here. I presented and reflected on 6 of these shorter videos, but they are so short that to summarize them wouldn't really have any point. My video about how calling someone a transphobe isn't an argument is pretty self-explanatory, so much so that actually a lot of the video is just me riffing on some other common arguments I get from TRAs that I dislike. But the big point I make, especially relevant to the title, is that I'll often get people coming onto my comments and saying that they wanted to hear what I had to say and they were interested in hearing my ideas, but then I said something transphobic and they realized that they just couldn't listen to anything I said anymore or take anything I said seriously after that. Well, not only is the accusation of transphobia a pretty bad argument, but it's definitely a very bad excuse for not even being willing to listen to the actual arguments the other side are making. Next, we have a 2-part video where I spoke about the actual policies that I would support to get towards certain key gender critical objectives. The first one is that we should get rid of unnecessarily gendered uniforms in schools and other institutions, because that simply reinforces the idea that the difference between men and women is about a costume. I also acknowledge in some contexts there may be certain accommodations that have to be made for post-op transsexuals that would amount to basically treating them as if they are members of the opposite sex, but this should be very limited and it would not be like the Gender Recognition Act, because it would not at all say that this actually makes them the opposite biological sex. I pointed out that a conversion therapy ban is totally pointless because all of the bad things about a conversion therapy ban, like holding people against their will and torturing them, are already illegal. And finally, I said that the state should probably come up with an official definition for woman so it's clear what they're talking about when they're talking about women. This way, if they put forward a bad definition, we can work against it, and if they put forward a good definition, we can use that to achieve key goals. And what we can definitely avoid is the current wishy-washy umming and erring we get from politicians where they refuse to actually commit to what they think a woman is. In my response to Jessie Gender, I actually put some effort into critiquing the quality of the video, because over this past year I've been trying to improve the quality of mine. So my main criticism of the video took the form of a pie chart where I showed that the vast majority of Jessie's video were irrelevant points and unnecessary asides, and that basically none of the video was advancing Jessie's actual claim that trans women aren't biologically male. The big recurring irrelevant argument was when Jessie repeatedly tried to conflate biological sex with gendered behaviour. But obviously everyone recognises that gendered behaviour is something that's fluid and can change all the time. If you combine that with biological sex, you haven't shown that biological sex is also fluid and can change, you've just grouped 2 fundamentally different things together. Tomorrow I could start wearing a dress, but I couldn't have a vagina. Acting as if wearing a dress and having a vagina can be combined together on some continuous gender sex matrix is completely nonsense and in fact deeply sexist. Here's my 4 main arguments for why the UK should be racially diverse. 1. A big part of British identity was the British Empire, which was multiracial, therefore being multiracial is part of British identity. 2. The UK's identity is also defined by being Christian. Christianity is a very pro-racial diversity religion. You can't be a racist, biblically faithful Christian. 3. It's also defined by liberalism. All the early liberals were from the UK and liberalism is very pro-racial diversity. 4. I like the UK and I like the idea that other people might like the UK. So if I think that other people might like the UK, why wouldn't I think people should be allowed to move here? Also, a lot of concerns about racial strife are complete nonsense, because even examples of stuff that comes close to that, like the 2020 Black Lives Matter demonstrations, weren't actually a bunch of black people causing all sorts of issues. It was mostly privileged white middle-class university students causing all the issues, while most black people in the UK just wanted to continue living their lives and contribute to this country by working hard and just being decent, normal, everyday, regular British people. So, being racist just doesn't appeal to me. Next, my main argument against Vorsh was that because there is a truth to sexed experiences, we need language to reflect that so we can understand reality. Vorsh claimed that he was perfectly able to understand reality and claimed that I can't understand reality because in rejecting trans identity, I can't understand the experiences that trans people go through. But obviously you can understand the experiences of those who profess a belief without having to think they're right about it. The real smoking gun though is that at one point, Vorsh accidentally conflates being a man with being biologically male, and I think it shows that I'm right that the best way to understand the categories of man and woman is with reference to biological sex, if even Vorsh, in trying to talk about this issue, kept accidentally affirming that I'm right and that biological sex is the main thing that matters. My next video started off with me physically writing down some binary code, and I pointed out that even though my ones might be a little bit wonky, and my zeros might not be perfect, they're still ones and zeros, and it's still binary code. The obvious analogy here would be to sex, where even though there might be some differences of sexual development, it doesn't change the fact that there's ultimately just male and female, and it is a binary system. Entering autumn now, we have my next video on spectra. My point here was that spectra are actually less able to deal with complexity than binaries, because the complexity of biological sex in the binary model is easily understood as just a potentially infinite amount of variation that can be within the two categories of male and female. But if you want to say that sex is a spectrum, then now all of that variability has to be placed on a single continuum relative to each other. And that is such a difficult, complex thing to do that no one who actually advocates for it has been able to provide any account of what the x-axis is actually supposed to be. Like many of my response videos, this one to Crash Course is quite difficult to summarize. So I'll keep it very simple and just focus on one point that I kept coming back to during this response. Human beings aren't clownfish. My next video addressed the quite niche question of whether or not trans identity emerged naturally from the material conditions of society, or instead was quite randomly constructed. My basic argument was that it did emerge from material conditions, but material conditions like patriarchy and homophobia, not the actual reality of biological males being women. In Are We the Baddies, I addressed this meme idea of somebody suddenly realizing that actually the side they've been along all along is evil. And I showed that this doesn't apply to gender criticals because GCs aren't Nazis. But I also said I don't like this meme in general because it's often used to pave over a lot of important political nuance. Whenever anything bad optically happens for a movement, this meme will be deployed as if everyone who believes in that idea should suddenly realize that they've clearly been on the wrong side, and that's just a very ignorant way to look at the world. My next video had a really basic point. If gender identity actually does matter a lot to people evaluatively and morally, that's all the more reason why third-person pronouns should not be referring to gender identity. Because then every single time you refer to someone, you're potentially insulting them and you're making some kind of judgment about them. Whereas that's much less the case if using sex pronouns, all you're doing is simply making an inaccurate statement about someone's biology. The big issue with the Jon Stewart TV show on the gender identity debate is that one of the experts he brings on accidentally conflates being a man with being biologically male, and then explicitly says that this is different from gender. So Jon's own expert on the show accidentally rejected trans ideology and shows that he recognizes that being a man is the same thing as being biologically male. I realize this is basically the exact same criticism I had of Vorsh in our debate, but personally, I think making it obvious that deep down you recognize that your side is wrong and the way you look at the world doesn't make any sense because you can't even be consistent with it is something worth including in my summary every time it comes up, and to be honest, it's so damning it's really the only thing I need to include. Next, we have another clip show because I was in Italy, so let's skip over that, and move directly onto my most popular video of last year, debunking the trans genocide. There are two basic points to this video. Firstly, a lot of trans activists, shockingly, are really stretching things when they claim that they're experiencing a genocide, and my big point is that it's utterly absurd for trans ideologues to claim that they're experiencing some sort of state repression when it's literally the exact opposite. They get special privilege afforded to them by the state. The state has official laws on the books saying that they're right, and it's those who disagree with them that are subject to state and academic and commercial repression. We finished October on a scary note by entering the horrific world of Ash Sakar interviewing trans ideologues. The basic premise of this video is that Ash Sakar's life sucks because she clearly supports trans ideology, but every theorist she's interviewed so far has been incapable of providing satisfying answers to even the most basic softball questions. It's hard to pick a specific example of these people just not answering the questions they've been asked, but probably the best example is when PhilosophyTube repeatedly claims to have nothing to do with the question of who is a woman because I'm just an actor. Whereupon Ash is forced to ask the obvious, what the hell are you talking about? You are a prominent edutainment and philosophy channel on YouTube, and you've made substantial videos on trans identity and what it means to be a woman before. You're literally just lying to me in claiming this has nothing to do with you. Poor Ash. To coincide with the US election, I made a video criticising the Electoral College. My two big arguments were, firstly, that if you're going to argue the US needs to afford special representation to states with a small population, why can't you also apply this to, for example, religious and racial minorities, where they might also have less representation, even though a lot of people would care more about belonging to a certain racial or religious group than they would about what state they come from. And even if you think affording special representation to smaller states is important, the Electoral College is still pointless because the Senate and the 10th Amendment already do a much better job at affording special representation to smaller states than the Electoral College ever could. In this video, Contra goes through various ways that we can define the term woman and basically ends up concluding that the only one that makes sense is the biological sex definition. The only argument given against the biological sex definition is the circular argument that it would involve having to reject trans identity. But Contra says that having no way to define woman or explain what you mean by saying you're a woman doesn't matter because trans women are claiming to be women, and only men care about being rational. So thank you, Contra, for doing my job for me and showing that trans ideology is both irrational and deeply sexist. I could not have done a better job myself. My video on Lonerbox is quite hard to summarize because it is itself a summary of 5 previous videos I'd made. However, for me, the big argument that hangs over my interactions with Lonerbox is that he's said before that the main argument for affirming trans identity is that gender dysphoria exists, and that's why we should affirm trans identity as valid. As such, he literally admits that any word could be completely robbed of its meaning, and that would be totally fine as long as it was shown that there was a mental health condition that meant that some people wanted that word to have no meaning. And I think that position is just obviously ridiculous. My main argument for free speech absolutism is pretty obvious really. If you're going to say there's certain opinions people aren't allowed to have, then you're going to be basically saying that any line of inquiry where those opinions could emerge is basically pointless, because what's even the point in having a discussion if people aren't allowed to express certain opinions in that discussion? As such, you're basically saying that the whole discussion, insofar as you want it to be open and free, is illegal. If we're willing to have a wide range of discussions as a society, which I think we should be, then we should also allow anyone to express whatever opinion they might hold on that discussion. In my video on whether a critique of homosexuality is similar to a critique of trans ideology, I point out that there is a massive difference between a non-moralistic, factual statement, like biological males can't be women, and a moralistic prescriptive judgment, like that it's wrong for a biological male to be in a relationship with another biological male. Those are two very different types of statements, and as such they pretty much can't be compared in any way at all. For my response to Mia Mulder on the history of transphobia, I'll try to stick to the basic titular point that Mulder fails to offer any real insights into why or from where transphobia emerged in Europe. The big claim is that transphobia came from Christianity because Christians were obsessed with the idea that sex should only be for reproduction. Missing from this is any account of why non-Christian cultures came to be transphobic, or why it would be that Christianity, more so than any other religious group, would particularly have believed that sex was important for reproduction. To commemorate the anniversary of J.K. Rowling making her big first gender-critical tweet, I made a video explaining just how important in hindsight that was. Specifically, J.K. Rowling shows how important it is for people with a lot of influence because of their activities outside of politics to still talk about important political issues. The reason why J.K. Rowling is so significant in the action she took is because loads of people already knew about her and respected her and were aware of her because of this fantasy adventure franchise that she wrote. And she has massively improved her legacy by using that influence to take a stand for a really important cause. And we conclude with my final video where I give 5 reasons why I'm not a Muslim. My biggest point is that since Islam claims to be a continuation of and an improvement on Christianity, it needs to be able to offer a substantial critique of Christianity. But any criticism that I've seen made of Christianity applies at least as much and often far more seriously to Islam. So Islam can literally only be defended through hypocritical reasoning. Anyway, everyone, that's kind of the end of the video. That's the summaries done. I'm going to conclude now, give the summary on my year, and I'm just going to be using vague notes for this. I didn't want to write out a whole script because I was kind of willing to ramble. We'll address this first because I'm aware of it. So I got some artificial lighting. Whoa. Ooh. Like, I'm sure there's a place I could put it that would make more sense, but obviously there's the fact I need to stand it up, so that's something we need to think about. I was like, I might as well start using it. Oh, that's kind of nice, actually. The other thing is, you'll notice I've got a bit of a dodgy voice. So yeah, I was really sick over the Christmas period. Well, I was okay for Christmas. Then on Boxing Day, I started feeling a bit rough. And yeah, by New Year's, well, no, I was okay at New Year's. I was basically, I think, so this Monday I was dead. And that was the lowest point. But essentially since Christmas, I've had some kind of sore throat. And this is the closest I've been to being able to record a video. I assume I sound rough enough that you can imagine that that it was a bit difficult to get through this. And yeah, I'm still going to do this ramble because why not? This idea of like people really getting into New Year on the 1st of January, that's something that I find strange because most people, I didn't. I went to sleep. I mean, I was ill, so I was asleep at midnight. But most people stay up late on New Year's Eve. So does anyone actually like have an attitude of, oh yeah, 1st of January, I'm literally going to completely change my life around? My general attitude, which I think I always have, is that really your New Year, new me mentality doesn't start until the first Monday of January, because it's like, okay, it's a new week. You get, you have your weekend, all that kind of stuff. That's my attitude anyway. I'm working through my notes of the things I wanted to say. I written down, this year has been great. Yeah, this past year has been fantastic. Have I not? Oh, so that's interesting. I haven't actually specifically written this down, which is funny because the whole time I was thinking about making this video, this was the main thing I was meaning to mention. And now I'm like, wait a minute, I didn't actually write this. So basically, at the end of 2023, I lost my job. I think I lost my job for very illegitimate reasons, I'll say that. I'll tell you what, I'll just give you a basic, I mean, it's over a year now, so I think I'm able to complain about it. Essentially, the job involved, I'm not going to get into any real details about it at all, but the job involved working across 2 sites. But it seemed like both people, or like the people at both sites, expected me to behave as if I was a full-time worker at both of them. So it's almost like, even though I was working across 2 sites, the amount of work I was being given was as if I was a full-time worker at both of them at the same time. So essentially it was a whole load of work, bearing in mind the fact that obviously, for me, I was doing that because, I was like, well, I've got to have, a proper job, get some money coming in. But I was also like, I love doing YouTube. I want to keep doing YouTube. So essentially I lost the job, because they thought that the work wasn't up to standard, which I do think was an illegitimate grievance, but whatever. And then I was like, you know what? Next year, I'm just going to pretend pretty much that I am committed to YouTube. So even though, like, my general attitude, the attitude which I think people would say maybe is sensible, is you should wait until it's clear that YouTube is a viable source of substantial income before you do that. I was like, well, at this point, I genuinely reached a point where I was like, it actually seems like YouTube is becoming for me, I reached a point where I was like, it's actually seemingly more realistic now that I will make YouTube work as my primary source of income, or, and this was my other thing, or I'll get a job, but a job that will be based on my, having done this YouTube. So maybe, for example, something in broadcast journalism or written journalism, something like that, where specifically me having done this channel will be the appeal. So that was basically my attitude. Either I do YouTube and when I get money off YouTube, or I do YouTube and then that becomes the main evidence for why I should have a different type of job that I would want to do. And I was saying that that makes more sense than the alternative of, at this point, trying to find a job that has nothing to do with YouTube, and just expecting that to be it. Because you've got to bear in mind, like, I know people who have careers that they are committed to, that they have experience in, and even they are talking about this job market being rough. So I was like, well, actually, no, yeah, I realized this is, because it's kind of funny, people talk about YouTube, like the idea of doing YouTube as a job is this kind of pie in the sky fantasy, which it really isn't. Because one, YouTube's hard work. Like, I don't really buy this idea that something can be a fantasy job if it's just as much, if not harder, work than a lot of jobs people are actually doing, like the kind of more traditional jobs. So it's not a fantasy and it's like an easy job. And I also don't think it's a fantasy, and I don't think it's that unrealistic. Nowadays, when you look at the current state of the job market, I'd say that someone who's like, actually, I'm going to try political commentary on YouTube and see if I can make money off of that, is being not much less rational than someone who's like, actually, I'm going to, update my CV and apply for all sorts of jobs that I want to do. And, that's how I'm going to make my money. Because, yeah, like I say, a lot of people are having some really tough time. I mean, insofar as I've applied to other jobs, it's not a very easy process. So that's essentially what happened. I was like, I'll just stick to it. As such, I started using the phrase 2024 grind set. That's what I said. It was like my little joke. And, well, I say it was a joke. I said it because I thought it was kind of like a funny thing to say, because it kind of, I don't know, has that vibe of being like some big lifestyle influencer, like, hey guys, get on your 2024 grind set, which felt like a funny thing, because that's not really the attitude I usually have in life. So I wasn't sure if I was going to take it seriously, but I guess I did. I actually took it really seriously. And when you look at the success I've had, it really is in keeping with a 2024 grind set. And it's like I often think, which is like, if I could go back to any point in the past, the one thing I would say to myself is just commit more to YouTube. Like people say, like, what's that? The one piece of advice you give to your young self? And literally at any point, it's always going to be commit more to YouTube, except for, I think, this past year. This is the only year where I'd say I don't have that regret. And that's a nice feeling to have, because it sucks that for 2023, 2022, 2021, 2020, like going back to, for as long as I've been an adult, if you were to say, what was the big thing that you would say to yourself, it would be commit more to YouTube. It sucks that that's like a big regret that hangs over all that time. I think should have been doing more. And yeah, this is the final time where I'm like, yeah, I actually feel like everything I should have been doing, I was doing, and the results were great. So it doesn't really make sense to say 2025 grind set, or 2025-7, sorry, I should say. Because obviously 2024-7 is 24/7 grind set. But I think it does make sense, because I'm going to go even harder. Because, I'm doing it 25/7. I'm talking 25 hours a day. Like, sure, there aren't technically 25 hours in a day, but I'm going to be grinding as if there are 25 hours in a day. I'm entering my 25/7 grind set. I do have plans for next year. I started a media review channel that had a lot of success early on, and it's faced an issue. But I got to bear in mind, I mean, this channel faced an issue. There was like a time on this channel where I just the views kind of stagnated and I couldn't really get out of it. And then I did get out of it, and that's what happened this past year. So that's nice to know that even when things are stagnating a bit, there's a way forward. So I'm going to try and find that out for my media review channel, like what the way is forward. Vlog and religion content. I've decided to, I'm not going to return to that until I'm happy with how everything else is, because I think that's the content. If you don't know, I do have a vlog channel where I have done some vlog stuff, not much. And I have a religion channel where I've done more religious stuff, again, not that much. But I don't really expect either of those channels to be channels that will really help in terms of the big goal right now, which is growing an audience. So, at some point that will happen. But I do have another plan. And the other plan is a secret plan. It's such a secret plan. Even when I start actioning that plan, I'm not going to tell you about it. If this plan works, I'm very proud of this plan. So it's a secret plan. I'm very proud of it. You will know about it because it will succeed. If that makes sense. It doesn't, but that's it. So I'll just let you know, I've got some plans for next year, which I'm pretty happy about. Yeah. Okay, I don't know why I wrote this right at the end. Sometimes I think, man, I can't believe how far I've been in just 1 year. Then I realize, statistically speaking, 1 year is more than the whole % of my life, and then I think, well, bloody hell, I better have come so far. And then the existential dread kicks in. Anyway, Happy New Year. And let's end with a final thank you to my patrons who were supporting me this whole year. You're very appreciated. And here's to even more patrons next year. And yeah, I think absolutely based on this year that's just been, there's no reason for me not to continue with what I resolved to do last year, which is, yeah, treat this as if, not exactly it's my fault. There's some other things, there's some small things. If I was making a 100% living wage from it, there would be a few other things I'd be doing. The big thing is reading. I would love to read a lot more and do a lot more research, which I can't really justify doing because obviously I'm not making a living wage from this, so I have to try and work out side hustles, and obviously the time I'm spending on those side hustles is time I can't spend on this channel. But I'm, at least as far as making the videos, acting as if this is my main thing. But yeah, it would be great to get to a point where this is my main thing and I can literally be like, no, yeah, I can treat this as my job in an even more substantial sense. So yeah, I'd love it if that happened in 2025. And either way, I hope you stick with me. Yeah, just really, really great. Really happy. Sorry, I don't think I actually formally, sorry, I said I was going to thank the patrons. Let me just say, yeah, thank you to everyone who contributes on Patreon. Really appreciate it. Because I was ill, I didn't do a bonus Patreon video, so I don't have to show you that. And I'll just say bye. Yeah, Happy New Year. Yeah, really good. Positive. Probably need to slightly work out a better situation with the lighting, but whatever. And this is what it looks like if it goes off. Big difference. Big difference. It's like a metaphor for my life. That's how this is, like, mentally. I genuinely would say, like, you know, like 2023 was okay, but like genuinely in some sense, like for me, this was 2023 and this was 2024. It's like night and day. And hopefully it's not, secular. Hopefully it's not like an alternating thing. Hopefully it's a better and better and better thing. All right.